Last week, we ended with the collapse of the Hittite Empire and the withdrawal of Egypt into its natural borders under the attacks of the so-called Sea Peoples. This week we'll look at the aftermath of those massive upheavals and what comes next in the Near East. First, a bit of review. The Sea Peoples were apparently a loose coalition of sea-born peoples who moved throughout the eastern Mediterranean during the 13th century BC. Where exactly they originated from is still a matter of debate, but the Egyptians clearly recorded that they were ethnically diverse and from somewhere to the north and west. During the latter half of the 13th century, their raids along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean caused massive disruption to the Hittite and Egyptian holdings in the Levant. Meanwhile, large populations were also moving through inland regions as well, and were probably behind the sacking of Hattusis about 1200 BC. With the disintegration of the Hittite Empire and Egypt's inability to defend the Levant, the Sea Peoples were mostly successful in taking land. The period between 1200 and 1000 BC is sometimes referred to as a Dark Age because, with the end of the major imperial powers in the Near East, we lose many of the historical records of this period. Archaeology, which is not exclusively dependent on historical records, tells us that this was hardly a Dark Age, however. The Levant still had vibrant, successful city-states in many regions, and Mesopotamian kingdoms to the east remained largely unaffected by the Sea Peoples. Furthermore, the image of the Sea Peoples as rapacious savages bent on slaughter and destruction is inaccurate. Archaeologically speaking, the most easily visible group of Sea Peoples were the Philistines. These people were called Peliset in Egyptian records, and were frequently written about in the Hebrew Bible's historical sections. Following the withdrawal of the Egyptians, they settled in the coastal plain of the southern Levant in what is now Israel and Gaza. Their artifacts and architecture make it clear that the Philistines were actually a sophisticated artistic people. Furthermore, they were probably transplanted Mycenaean Greeks, as they continued to make Greek-style pottery and build Greek-style temples in their new homeland. We know that, back in Greece, the Bronze Age palaces were mostly abandoned around this same time. This suggests that the Sea Peoples, whom Egypt saw as hostile savages, may well have been refugees fleeing unrest themselves. Unfortunately, a lot more archaeological work needs to be done to determine just what motivated these Greeks to flee eastward. At any rate, by about 1000 BC, the population movements characterized by the Sea Peoples had finished. Most groups were mostly settled again in new homelands, and the political map of the Near East stabilized once again. This period is the so-called Iron Age. It's important to understand what's implied by the term Iron Age, since such terms are rarely formally defined. Prior to the advent of civilization in the Near East, cultures relied on stone technology, and archaeologists refer to the end of this Stone Age as the Neolithic, specifically the New Stone Age. Traditionally, the Stone Age gave way directly to the Bronze Age, but today some scholars insert a brief Copper Age in between. In either case, these periods mark the advent of metallurgy and the emergence of civilization in the Near East. They last from the mid-4th millennium to the start of the 1st millennium BC. The first half of the 1st millennium is called the Iron Age, followed by the classical period of Greece and Rome in the second half. In the Stone, Bronze, Iron Age designations, what's being referred to is the most sophisticated technology available for practical uses at the time. During the Stone Age, no metals were used at all in practical applications. Some metals may have been used in jewelry or decoration, but not as tools. During the Bronze Age, the most advanced metallurgy was bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that could be used to cast useful tools. However, throughout the Bronze Age, bronze was very expensive and difficult to get one's hands on. It relied on tin, a rare metal that had to be imported into the Near East from distant locales. So most of the common farmers continued to use stone or copper tools for daily use. Likewise, the Iron Age is marked by the spread of iron for expensive and particularly valuable tools, especially weapons and armor. But it was not especially common in the daily lives of common folk until much later. As your textbook points out, the reason that Near Eastern states shifted to iron technology probably had very little to do with iron's technological advances over bronze. When the Egyptian and Hittite empires went away, they took with them the long-distance trade networks that provided tin for bronze. Thus, Near Eastern populations had no choice but to start experimenting with iron smelting and forging. On the other hand, when state governments and the populations they support start shifting to new resources, the geopolitical map will also shift. The new demand for iron ore and for control of different trade routes probably drove the developments in the early Iron Age, especially in the Levant. In addition to the Philistine city-states established along the coast, the Levant in the early Iron Age is characterized by the emergence of two important regional civilizations, Israelite and Phoenician cultures. The Israelite kingdoms, Israel proper to the north and Judah to the south, are of course extremely important in understanding the future development of Western civilization, since their traditions form the basis of three major modern world religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Hebrew Bible recounts the history of the Israelites going back to the Middle Bronze Age, or the early 2nd millennium BC, in this region that it calls Canaan. According to this tradition, the Israelites began as a nomadic tribe of desert herders who immigrated to Canaan from Mesopotamia sometime around the start of the 2nd millennium. Sometime several generations later, they migrated to Egypt, where after a brief period of political influence, they became oppressed and enslaved by the native Egyptians. After escaping slavery in Egypt, they spent a generation or so as nomads in the deserts of Sinai and the Negev. Then, about 1200 BC or so, they invaded Canaan, which they conquered in short order. As your textbook points out, this narrative is difficult to reconcile in detail with the archaeological record. Specific details of dates, places, and names do not align well at all with what we know of life in the 2nd millennium. Some modern Israeli archaeologists have gone so far as to suggest that the whole story is a later fiction. However, a careful reading and an understanding of how oral histories form and function shows that things are perhaps not so clear. We know, for example, that people from Canaan did migrate to Egypt in the early 2nd millennium, and that they did enjoy political influence and power under the Hyksos dynasties. Later, the native Egyptians, while not enslaving the Asiatic peoples, did expel them. Most of the expelled Hyksos probably did spend time as rural, dispossessed nomads before eventually rejoining late Bronze Age Canaanite civilization. Likewise, archaeological evidence suggests that the stylistic and cultural forebears of early Israelite culture had existed for a long time in the hill lands east of the Jordan River, on the fringes of Canaanite civilization, and that these cultural markers spread westward mostly peacefully. The biblical account indicates that this east-to-west path was the route taken by so-called Israelite invaders. While there appears to have been no military conquest, there may well have been sporadic bouts of violence where former desert nomads, allied now with eastern hill farmers, pushed into lower-lying areas west of the Jordan River. Likewise, if we fast forward into the early Iron Age, biblical accounts of the early Israelite kingdoms are not wholly incompatible with archaeological evidence. While dates and place names can often not be reconciled with position, the archaeological record does indicate the emergence of Israelite kingdoms as powerful regional players not long after the start of the 1st millennium. The now canonical scriptures are certainly heavily biased, propagandistic revisions compiled centuries later, but they are probably not wholly fictional. What we do know for certain is that by the middle part of the 9th century, about 853 BC, the king of Israel was a powerful enough ruler to be named in extra-biblical records as taking part in a coalition against Assyrian aggression. In the same general time frame, an inscription from Tel Dan, an important city in northern Israel, mentions the House of David, confirming that the royal house of that name did in fact exist. The other rising power in the Levant was the Phoenicians, a series of coastal city-states in the northern Levant centered in what is now Lebanon. The two most prominent of these city-states were Tyre and Sidon, who remained very influential city-states for centuries and are still occupied today. The Phoenician culture was renowned throughout the Mediterranean region for its skilled craftsmen and artists, and for its trading navy. Phoenician traders navigated throughout the Mediterranean, Black, and Red Seas, bringing foreign goods from across the known world into the Near East. Some stories even suggest they circumnavigated Africa as early as about 600 BC. The Phoenicians were also avid colonizers. While their homeland was in the northern Levant, they by no means felt obliged to stay there. They established trading colonies throughout the Mediterranean, as far abroad as Spain and northwestern Africa, and used these colonies to control trade routes and the sources of valuable commodities. The most successful and powerful of these colonies was Carthage, in what is now Tunisia. It grew to become the seat of an empire in its own right, and was the primary early rival to Rome. We'll discuss Carthage more in a few weeks. One more important innovation is credited to the Phoenicians, and it ties directly into their trading interests. As we saw several weeks ago, the origin of writing in the Near East derived at least in part from the need to record and track economic transactions. Cuneiform, which had evolved from Mesopotamian commodities tokens, had become the standard writing system throughout the Near East. But the syllabic system used by cuneiform was cumbersome. Each symbol represented the combination of a consonant and a vowel, such as ta, te, ti, to, tu, ka, ke, ki, ko, ku, and so on. This meant that to write a given language, one needed hundreds of symbols, and different languages needed different sets, since they used different syllables. The Phoenicians developed an alphabetic system. In an alphabet, each symbol represents a single sound, called a phoneme. Symbols are combined to form syllables, and syllables are combined to form words. Since languages use far fewer phonemes, and there's much more overlap between languages in which phonemes they use, an alphabet can get by with far fewer symbols than a syllabary. Alphabets are much easier to learn and use, therefore. Early quasi-alphabetic writing dates back to about 1700 BC in the Sinai Peninsula. By the 11th century BC, Phoenician city-states were using the first full-fledged alphabetic writing system. The idea proved so useful it quickly spread to the neighboring Israelite kingdoms, eventually evolving into modern Hebrew script, and to Greece, eventually becoming both the modern Greek and Latin alphabets. While these developments were taking place in the Levant, Mesopotamian states were not dormant. The disintegration of the Hittite Empire in northern Mesopotamia and the fall of the Kassite dynasty in Babylonia shortly thereafter opened the door for the rise and power of Assyria. It would go on to become the first great world power of the Iron Age. Assyrian history is traditionally divided into three phases. We first encountered the city of Ashur and its king last week when we discussed traders' colonies dispatched to Anatolian city-states during the early second millennium. This is the Old Assyrian period, when Ashur was a powerful northern Mesopotamian kingdom, but not capable of conquering an empire. After the Mitanni kingdom fell to the Hittites around 1300 BC, their eastern holdings became independent again and established a Middle Assyrian kingdom, which was a major northern Mesopotamian power for the next several centuries. This ended with the death of King Tiglath-Pileser I in 1076 BC, and was followed by more than a century when Assyria was dominated by various other northern Mesopotamian kingdoms. But in the late 10th century BC, Assyrian kings once again gained the upper hand over their rivals and established a new Assyrian kingdom. Soon thereafter, King Ashur-nasir-pal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 BC, moved the kingdom's capital from Ashur to Nimrud, turning the older city into a religious center rather than a capital. He also set out on a program of aggressive and often brutally bloody imperial expansion. Taking advantage of the fact that there were at the time no major powers in the region, Ashur-nasir-pal succeeded in picking off rival kingdoms and city-states one by one and extending his control to much of northern Mesopotamia. His successors would go on over the next 250 years to conquer most of the Near East. Sargon II would conquer the northern Israelite kingdom, that is Israel proper, in 722 BC, and his successor Sennacherib defeated Babylon to take southern Mesopotamia. By 647 BC, both Egypt and Elam had fallen to Assyrian control, though Egypt soon reasserted its independence. By the time that the Assyrian Empire reached its highest point in the late 600 BC, however, it ruled most of the Near East. In the previous 300 years, Assyria had been ruled from no fewer than 4 capitals: Ashur, then Nimrud, briefly from Khorsabad, and finally from Nineveh. Each of these cities had massive proportions. Nimrud was 360 hectares, Khorsabad a comparatively small 300 hectares. Nineveh, though, was a behemoth, 750 hectares, with a population between 100 and 150,000 people. Nineveh was a city well worthy of being the capital of a major empire. It had several large royal palaces constructed by different kings and administrative and scholarly centers to rival anywhere in the ancient world. Archaeologist Stephanie Daly has even suggested that the fabled Hanging Gardens of Babylon were in fact located here, and then mistakenly attributed to Babylon by later writers. This is because the royal compounds in the middle of the desert city of Nineveh were kept lush and green by extensive irrigation systems powered by advanced pumps and machinery. Nineveh is rightly famous in archaeological circles because it was one of the places where archaeology began as a true science. Austen Henry Layard, an Englishman and one of the first scientific excavators, dug there in the 1840s. He discovered many of the most stunning artifacts now attributed to the Assyrian Empire, including the massive winged bull statues that guarded the city gates. But the most important find he uncovered was the archive of Assyrian king Assurbanipal. Unlike many other ancient archives, which consist mostly of dry bureaucratic documents and the occasional letter, these archives were also filled with works of literature, science, and history. Assurbanipal apparently recognized the value of scholarship and instructed his people to scour the empire for important documents, translate them to Akkadian if necessary, then curate them in the capital. It is primarily due to his foresight that we today have many of the great works of Mesopotamian scholarship preserved for study. Assyrian propaganda held that they were merciless, bloody, and cruel. This frightened their enemies and made rebellion less likely. While it does seem that some of the bloodiest punishments depicted in Assyrian art were really carried out, the archaeology of the empire also indicates a carefully thought-out rule following the brutal subjugation. Imperial policy held that large portions of newly conquered populations should be moved to other parts of the empire. This both discouraged rebellion by isolating people from their places of power, and also encouraged resettlement in newly developed farmland. Until now, agriculture in the northern Mesopotamian heartland of Assyria had relied primarily on natural rainfall. While this was sufficient for the local populations, it could not handle the massive influx of foreign immigrants, both voluntary and coerced, that came with the empire. To compensate, the government undertook a massive program to create and maintain an irrigation system throughout the Assyrian heartland. Agricultural productivity took off, and immigrants could spread across the landscape, producing food both for themselves and for the massive urban populations in Nimrud and Nineveh. The Assyrian Empire reached its greatest extent under Assurbanipal, who finally succeeded in conquering the Elamites and incorporating their territory into the empire. He ruled from Nineveh until 627 BC, but soon after his death, the empire began to fall apart. As so often had happened in the past of Mesopotamia, it proved difficult to maintain control over the ethnically diverse populations of the empire's conquests. One of the most rebellious was Babylon, still fiercely independent and looking back to its own empires under Hammurabi and the Kassites. In 612 BC, an alliance led by Babylonians took advantage of the disorder following Assurbanipal's death to sack and burn Nineveh. This effectively brought the Assyrian Empire to an end, leaving the Babylonian king Nabopolassar in control of most of Mesopotamia. Nabopolassar's son was Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled from 605 to 655 BC. He came to the throne soon after the sacking of Nineveh and set about recovering as much of the Assyrian Empire as he could. To distinguish Nebuchadnezzar's empire from those that came before, we refer to this as the NEO-BABYLONIAN Empire. He largely succeeded in recreating the Assyrians' accomplishments, and by some measures probably surpassed them. For example, one of the highlights of Nebuchadnezzar's reign was the conquest in 586 BC of the southern Israelite kingdom Judah and the sacking of its capital Jerusalem. The Assyrians had never accomplished this, though they had forced the Judahites to pay tribute. Nebuchadnezzar looted the Israelite temple for war trophies, which he took back to Babylon, and deported several thousand of the leading Judahites to Babylonia. This marked a turning point in Jewish history, known as the Babylonian captivity. During this time, exiled leaders began to compile and edit their sacred texts into a coherent canon, the basis of the modern Hebrew Bible. Nebuchadnezzar enjoyed a long reign of 50 years, after which 3 rulers passed in quick succession, dying in palace intrigues and possibly literal backstabbing. Stability was restored when Nabonidus, from 555 to 539 BC, came to the throne. He became known as a builder and restorer. With the empire already in control of what most Babylonians considered the known world, he concentrated on rebuilding and enhancing temples and public works throughout Mesopotamia. For archaeologists, he is also known as history's first archaeologist. Many of his restoration projects were restoring temples on sites that had been sacred for several thousand years by this point. Prior to laying new brick or stone, Nabonidus often instructed his workmen to dig into the foundations of the temples to recover artifacts of earlier eras, which he then displayed in the first museum in his daughter's palace in Ur. During this period, the Neo-Babylonian Empire continued the Assyrians' pattern of increasingly large urban settlements. Babylon had been a large, influential city for more than 1,000 years by this time, and had been the seat of important state governments for much of that time. It had grown to be probably by far the largest city on Earth. Its outer fortifications encircled 15 square kilometers, or 1,500 hectares. Not all of that area would have been built up, of course, but just the inner city, the seat of government and religion, covered 384 hectares, half the size of the entire city of Nineveh. At its height under Nabonidus, perhaps as many as 200,000 people lived in Babylon. These details of large Mesopotamian cities, Uruk and Ur and Nimrud, Nineveh and Babylon, show that much of the ancient history of the Near East was one of increasing urbanization. Not only was population growing over the last few thousand years BC, but an increasing portion of the population was living in cities. This long-term trend can be attributed to a few factors. Increasing agricultural productivity meant a smaller number of farmers could feed the population. Endemic warfare throughout the region drove people to the safety of the cities. And long-established trade networks brought needed foreign trade goods first to the cities. But it also reveals that the peoples of the Near East were evolving ways of life that were increasingly focused on cities and the services they provided. From our perspective, many centuries in the future, we can still look back and call these cities early, but for the Iron Age peoples of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, Babylon had simply always been there as part of their lives. Even their mythology had largely forgotten a time when cities did not exist. For all Nebuchadnezzar's conquests and all Nabonidus' public works, their empire was not immune to the pattern of rise and fall that, by now, had existed for almost 2,000 years in Mesopotamia. Babylon had come back to imperial power partially due to the help of the Medes, a people from the Iranian plateau east of Mesopotamia. While the Neo-Babylonians had consolidated power in Mesopotamia and the Levant, the modest Median Empire had focused on areas north of Mesopotamia, conquering the kingdom of Urartu in Armenia and threatening the powerful Anatolian kingdom of Lydia. One of their subject peoples were the Persians, also from the Iranian plateau. In 550 BC, a Persian leader named Cyrus the Great rebelled against his Median overlords and took control of the Median Empire. This was the first of several Persian empires throughout history, traditionally known as the Achaemenid Empire, after Cyrus's ancestor Achaemenes. Not satisfied with just taking over, Cyrus and his successors embarked on a program of military expansion previously unknown in the Near East. In 539, Cyrus captured Babylon in a whirlwind campaign, effectively absorbing the Neo-Babylonian Empire in a single sweep. His son and successor, Cambyses, conquered Egypt in 525 BC, and the next king, Darius, who ruled from 522 to 486 BC, brought the empire to its greatest extent, stretching from the Aegean Sea in the west to the Indus River Valley in the east, and from the Caucasus Mountains south to Nubia. It was the largest empire the world had ever known. It also marks the point where most accounts of the Iron Age in the Near East end. In subsequent generations, important developments in civilization in that part of the world shift farther west into southern Europe. In fact, the major rival to confront the ACHAEMENIDs came from Greece under the banner of Alexander the Great. In a few weeks, we'll see what result came from that confrontation.